Our next speaker, we're going to be doing here a little Q&A, I think gets to really the question that was just asked. So Mr. Tran currently runs a trade policy consulting firm in Hanoi, and prior to setting up his own company, he was a deputy minister at the Ministry of Industry and Trade for 13 years, and also served as the chief trade negotiator for Vietnam. The insights he's developed over the last 20 years are unmatched, and so as we think about trade and trade policy driving Vietnam forward, we could not have a better speaker to guide us during this conversation. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Eric. Good morning, everybody. I'm very honored to be here today, and I very much hope that our following discussion will be helpful to you in one way or another. Thank you.
So as you look back on your experience, what were the key milestones in trade policy that really shaped Vietnam's economic development?
When we look back, there are indeed certain milestones in our economic integration process. I hope you remember 1995 when we participated in ASEAN, and then we joined the first free trade area ever. It was the AFTA, the ASEAN Free Trade Area. It was the first time that we made the commitments in trading goods. We decided to open up our trading goods sector for the outside. And then the second milestone was the bilateral trade agreement with the US. It was the first time we opened up the services sector. For the first time, we made the commitments in terms of investment and IPR protection. And then you knew that we joined the WTO in 2007. This is another milestone. The WTO accession has transformed Vietnam wholly. Together with the BTA, the WTO regulation transformed Vietnam and making us a more open, more market-oriented economy. And our regulation, especially trade regulation, has become much closer to the world standards. And the rest became the history. We were more confident. We decided to negotiate the new generation free trade areas with the TPP country and then the EU country. And this time, for the first time ever, we made our commitments in terms of government procurement, and then the e-commerce, and then the state-owned enterprises, and of course the sustainable development concerning the labor and environment. So the comprehensive set of commitments, and indeed they have transformed my country.
So when you think about it, we talk about trade and people think about FDI, but as Michael just shared and Viet Le shared, it's really about the population, it's about the emerging middle class. And so how do you think that trade policy has impacted the development of the Vietnamese economy, and how has trade policy, how has it had a role as a catalyst for the growth of the domestic economy?
It was decisive. It was really a game changer. We all started in 1986. You still remember Doi Mai. This is what we called, what we did in 1986. We decided to open our economy to the private sector inside the country. And it was a real revolution for Vietnam at that time. And we still very much respect our people who did that revolution back then in 1986. But if you imagine Vietnam like a car, then 1986 is something that you ignited the car. We didn't know much at that time about how to go forward. We needed a philosophy. We needed a more systematic approach. And that is why we decided to learn from our neighbors, to open up our economy. And then we got 1995, we got 2000, and we got 2007, the milestones that I mentioned. So the trade policy and the trade engagement is somehow like a pedal gas the gas pedal for that car. You ignite the car, but then you need to find out some way to press the pedal for the car to go forward. And the trade policy was indeed the gas pedal for our country.
Please ask some questions. So as we think about it, would you describe that the trade policies were intentional in terms of developing the domestic economy? And was it really about manufacturing, or was it truly about developing the emerging middle class?
I think they are connected. The trade has helped our country to attract the foreign direct investment into the country, and it helped develop the new production capacity. So you mean manufacturing. And if you have the developing manufacturing sector, other sectors will develop as well, and it will bring income to the people, and you will have the new middle class in the country. So you're right, the trade was the main catalyst at the very beginning to help us to be where we are today.
So, you know, people have certainly seen what's happened in terms of the transitions in leadership and people in different roles. So with the changes in key positions, is there a risk that trade policies that you've certainly been a part of, do you think they'll be de-emphasized? Do you think they'll continue? How do you look at the people and roles and then look at the policies that you think will be moving forward?
Mr. Donlam was right. From the very beginning, he said that whoever is there in the leadership, our policy will not change. I fully agree with that. But objectively, you can see that we are a bit dependent on our trade. For example, this year we may have something like 400 billion US dollars in export. It's nearly 100% of our GDP. If you include imports, then international trade accounts for almost 200% of our GDP. So we are very dependent on trade. And trade in itself is very dependent on foreign direct investment. 72% of our export is brought about by the FDI enterprises in this country. So the U-turn is impossible. No. It's about jobs, it's about income, it's about prosperity for our people. So whoever will be there, I don't think there will be any change in our policy. And second, we are very famous of being so serious about our commitments, not only commitments in terms of trade agreements, but also our commitments towards the foreign investor, direct investor and indirect investors. And that's why, no, I don't anticipate any change in our policy. We will still remain open. We will still pro-trade and pro-investment. But at the same time, we know that we are a bit vulnerable. When you are 200% dependent on the outside, and somebody mentioned the chaosity, you mentioned the chaosity. We are vulnerable. And 10%, we are among the 3 countries, Michael said, that's so dependent on the US economy. We are vulnerable. And that is why if you ask me about the future direction, I think that we still remain open, but at the same time, the focus may shift towards the domestic demand, taking into account the fact that Michael mentioned that our middle class is rising, and we will be having more and more purchasing power. And it's high time to look to domestic market in order to compensate for anything that may happen on the outside. And investment in infrastructure is also another thing that we might be focusing on, because if you care about, for example, the high-speed railway that we are now talking about, 70 billion US dollars, I think, can compensate for some loss of our markets if something bad happening outside.
So to the extent, in this just happened to be, I think, set up well, so Michael's comments about obviously trade and exports really drove the economy forward, but you would agree, in a sense, that creates maybe a heightened sense of vulnerability because Vietnam may be too dependent on trade. Okay, interesting.
Yes. It is not good. You need a more balanced approach. Yeah.
Interesting. So, you know, we talked about China and the U.S. a little bit. In the next 5 years, do you see Vietnam's share of trade with the U.S., which is the biggest export market, and China, which is the biggest import market? Do you see that changing in any way?
It's a very interesting question.
Not a fair question. Not a fair question.
Interesting to answer. It's very difficult to answer to that question because it may depend on November in the U.S. Michael is right. Whoever will be there, the policy will not change a lot. But it is only about China. About Vietnam, thank you, ma'am, for your question. And Michael is right. If there is a 10% across the board, everybody will be in the same position. Only the final demand in the US may decrease a little bit, but everybody will end up with the same position. But if you remember, then at the end of 2020, before Trump left the office, the USTR and the Department of Treasury of the US, they found Vietnam guilty of being a currency manipulator. But they couldn't proceed with that decision, and they left that for the next government. And we got lucky that the next government, they decided to go other way. They didn't have any tariff on the exports from Vietnam. So we don't know if there is something like a discrimination against Vietnam. If Trump wins, and if Trump and his administration continue to have that kind of Vietnam targeted measure, in that case, things could be very different. And the outcome could be very devastating. I don't know. It all depends on geopolitical consideration of Trump administration if he wins in November.
We'll have you back next year. We can revisit this conversation either way. You know, so a question just came in via the Slido app, and if this is something that you're comfortable with. Oh, there's a couple. Okay. I'll ask the last one then. How do you think Vietnam will progress in privatization of key infrastructure sectors, power distribution, public transport, sea or kind of ports, airports? It's not trade related, but oftentimes it is because it's certainly related. Do you see, as Vietnam thinks about building kind of national champions, do you see privatizations increasing as a way to further develop the private sector?
I think in Vietnam we have another word for that. We don't call that privatization. We call that equitization. It's one way for you to collect the money from the public. And you know, infrastructure is a big game. It needs a lot of money. And my government already said they want to be independent. They can borrow, but of course they cannot be in a debt trap. So that is why they will be trying to borrow from inside the country rather than from outside. How you can borrow? You can have some kind of bond, but at the same time you can equitize your projects in order to collect the money from the people, from the public, including the indirect investors from outside. So yes, I fully believe that sooner or later, they will be equitizing not only ports, but also the airports, but other big projects of the country. On power distribution, I don't know. I really don't know. Because for us, we have the, first of all, the food security, and second, energy security. There are two, I might say, kind of taboos in Vietnam. We are a food exporting country, the top right exporter, but at the same time, we still maintain the very big state-owned company, which is VinaFood One, because we care about food security. And second, about energy security, you see a lot of things happening, but we still have the EVN there as the SOE. And I don't know, I don't think that we will be equitizing our power transmission soon.
Yeah, and it makes sense given where Vietnam is today, but I think, you know, what we've talked about with Michael and with others is we do think that there will be more, I don't want to call it support, but we'll see more companies like FPT, which has half of its revenue overseas. We see more Vietnamese companies kind of becoming, you know, leading companies in Vietnam, but also outside of Vietnam. Is that something you see Vietnam supporting?
Yes. Yes.
Question here. So green energy is extremely important for both manufacturing and AI, which is extremely energy dependent. Do you see Vietnam policy in this area moving forward? And I know this isn't maybe your total focus, but yeah.
Yes, yes. I used to be there at the MOIT, Industry and Trade, and I know a bit. Yes, the vision is good. You already heard about the vision 2050 and the net zero. But there is a gap between the vision and the reality. And you know that where the gap comes from. The gap comes from the people being so afraid of proposing something new. And that is why we waited for so long for PDP 8. And then we waited for so long for the implementation plan to come. But I think the people already learned about that. The Prime Minister learned about that. And Michael mentioned that they could do something that they used to do in 6 years, 4 years. Now they could do in 6 months. So I very much hope that they will be accelerating the speed in the future in order to make the reality closer to the vision of Vietnam in terms of green energy.
And two questions came in about this, and I think it's very interesting to be in Vietnam where climate impact or climate change is not politicized. It's viewed as a fact, and Vietnam is certainly very susceptible to rising tides and to climate change. And so the question is here, you know, does the government perceive a long-term risk to the economy and jobs from climate risks? And what priority does that take place in terms of either policy or generating kind of green and sustainable practices? Kind of getting to that gap.
Yeah. First of all, we care about our people. And we know the impact of the climate change, and we care a lot about Mekong Delta. So you see my government has been doing everything in order to save the people in the Mekong Delta for the rising sea level. That is the first priority. The second priority is that to develop the green energy, the wind energy and the solar energy in order to meet our commitment in terms of net zero. That is the first two priorities, and other priorities might come later. For example, training the people to care more about the climate change or the carbon market, certificate market. Other will come later, but the first two priorities is Mekong Delta and the green energy.
Okay. And do you think that, so as we think about, you know, the power generation capacity that needs to happen to fulfill Vietnam's kind of 6.5 GDP growth for the next 5 years, are you confident that Vietnam can develop that power in a way that's still sustainable in line with reaching the other goals?
According to my Prime Minister, we might be confident. But in my personal view, there are some difficulties closing the gap between the vision and the reality. It will require a lot of action from the government. And not only the Prime Minister, we are confident that he will be doing everything he can, but we need a much better coordination among the ministries, with the Ministry of Industry and Trade on top in the right driving seat, but we need the help and the coordination from other ministries as well. Somebody mentioned the zoning issue, site clearance issues, the legal framework issues. There are a lot of things that we need to cover in order to bridge the gap between reality and our vision.
So is this less more of a broad policy issue, but really more of an execution issue at the provinces?
Yes, execution issues.
Do you think now, when certainly we have perceived, stable leadership at least until the next election in 2026, do you think that we're in a position now where things, and certainly to Michael's point about real estate, things should actually move faster in the next few years than they had in the previous few years?
Yes.
Okay.
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think so.
You do think so?
Yes.
And why? Because I think that's very important.
Because we have the new leader.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think this is...
He, as far as I know him, he's a very pragmatic person. And you following lately the press in Vietnam, and you can see or you can feel that there is a change in the policy, that we are more now focusing more on the economic development. It doesn't mean that we stop the anti-corruption campaign. Anti-corruption is still going on. But the General Secretary, our President, already mentioned that we don't need to allow the anti-corruption campaign to hinder our economic development. That would ease people, that would ease the anxiety of the government officials. And I do believe that with that kind of motivation, things will gradually change.
And I think it's very important. I want to make sure that I kind of, frankly, just reinforce that point, because the questions that we've been receiving really over the last 12 to 18 months were, will the anti-corruption campaign inhibit economic growth? And in your view and your experiences, anti-corruption campaign doesn't stop, but it will not inhibit economic growth. That's kind of the conclusion.
Another balance. Another balance that I told you, that we need to have to find some balanced approach between outside and inside. And for anti-corruption and economic development, we also need to find out some balance between that. Yeah. And of course, anti-corruption is still going on, but at the same time, the focus should be there on the economic development, and we don't need to allow the anti-corruption campaign to have the impact on the mindset of the people inside the government. We need to boost the creativity. We need to have more technocrats coming into the government to help the people with the economic development.
Okay. All right, so that's kind of concluded our prepared remarks. I can throw more questions we haven't prepped for, but before I do that, let me just see if there's any questions in the audience.
Mr. Khanh, thank you so much for sharing your insight, which is extremely helpful. And one of the questions I want to ask for your comment is that I think that Vietnam now, since you are the chief negotiator for the BTA, has become maybe among the top 5 largest trading partners to the US. And so even if the result of the November in the US, I think that the US will still need Vietnam to export, because given the fact that they will continue the tariff policy to the China. So do you think that with that comment, the impact of even if Mr. Trump win the election, they still need Vietnam?
I'm not American, and as I said that it will all boils down to geopolitical consideration of Trump. Somebody said that in his first term, he was very kind of patient on Vietnam. He mentioned Vietnam a lot, but he didn't do anything against Vietnam. But at the end of his term, you saw that currency manipulator naming already. That is why we really don't know We really don't know. It might happen that there will be higher tariff for the goods coming from China, and the consequence is the FDI will be coming over from China to Vietnam, and Vietnam will be the beneficiary. But it could be at the same time that they will be applying the anti-circumvention tariff, and in that case we will not be benefiting a lot from the high tariff from China. But it all depends. Yeah, trade is a big game, and sometimes the geopolitical considerations are the reason behind each and every move. So I still don't know what kind of geopolitical consideration this time for Mr. Trump, taking into account the chaosity that we are having now.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Khanh, for your very valuable insight. My question is a follow-up on that one. How does Vietnam manage its bamboo strategy in a way which essentially avoid backlash? And I'm taking the recent visit of Putin in Vietnam. I was shocked when I heard it, and yet it seems that it went with nobody noticing it.
If you follow Vietnam history, you may see that we've been applying the bamboo diplomacy for a long time, a very long time, even in the past. We won over China. China invaded Vietnam a number of times. We won China, but even after that we won, we still come to China to seek the friendly relationship. Mr. Tran was the master of bamboo diplomacy, and that is he brought the bamboo diplomacy to the new level. But it came the deep root in our history, and it is also not only Vietnam is following that bamboo diplomacy. Many other countries, you see Thailand. They never had any war in Thailand because of the bamboo diplomacy, or Singapore or other ASEAN countries. That is the only way that a small country can cope with the polarization of the world. So I think it's a must for the small countries like Vietnam. And we certainly will be following that policy. But I think it will become more and more difficult in the future, much more difficult, because it is not ideological thing anymore. It will be also the economical thing. What if there will be the two supply chains in the world? One with China as the colonel, and another one with the US and EU in the center. What supply chain you will be participating in? And now, what if there will be two internets? You have the GPS, but at the same time, they have Baidu already. So you have the high-speed rail of European Union standards, but at the same time, we have the Chinese high-speed rail standards. So what if there will be two supply chains? You will have to choose side. So I don't know. I very much hope that it will not happen. We will have one supply chain in order to save our energy, our efforts, our resources. But with the policy that we are now seeing, two supply chain could be a reality.
Thank you.
I'm not even sure what to say.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Well, with that, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing your insights.
Thank you.
Okay, so again, thank you so much for your questions, and we'll see you in 15 minutes. Thank you.